Well, good evening, everybody. How are y'all today? Y'all are so boisterous this evening. I'm just teasing. Well, it's been a pretty good week in Tennessee. The Vols won twice in a row, so everybody's been pretty happy about that. We'll see about this week. They should win them there too. But anyway, it's great to see everybody tonight. We're starting out in the first lesson tonight in the book of Romans. Now, I have handed out to everybody here 2 printouts of different outlines of the book of Romans. You can break the book of Romans down in different ways. Some people break it down more detailed, some not as much. Dale, they're right there on this corner over there. So that's something for you to keep, maybe put in your book. I'm going to be walking through this a little differently, this book. What I'd like to do is basically go through, read the text, drop back and kind of paraphrase down the verses, and then summarize sections at a time, and then summarize the chapter as a whole. So we'll see how that turns out. Hopefully it helps us to get a better understanding of the flow of the book and what Paul is talking about. And speaking of Paul, Paul was the writer of the book of Romans. It's actually, the actual title is To the Romans. We just call it Romans, of course. This was written, ironically, it was written, I'm going to say 57 AD, because some say 56, some say 58. Most people believe it was written 57, somewhere in the latter part of 57. It's believed it was written in Corinth by Paul. He stayed there on his missionary, his third missionary journey, but he was coming back to Jerusalem, with contributions from the Church of Macedonia and Achaia. And we know from the latter part of the book, Paul dictated the letter itself. He didn't handwrite it. He dictated it to Tertius. And, okay. Christians, Jews in Rome. How did that come about? General Pompey conquered the Jewish nation and Jerusalem. And during that time, he took a large section of Jewish people from the nation back to Rome as slaves. So that's how that original population of Jews started out in Rome. Then years later, during the different celebrations, Jews are required to come back to Jerusalem twice a year. And we know from Acts 2:10 there, where that's, of course, where Peter gives the first sermon. And Pentecost and so forth, when the flame came down and they talked in different languages, there's a specific notation there that there were people from different areas. And there were people from Rome, Jews from Rome, there at that time. So it's believed that's the first seed of Christianity that was taken back to Rome. So that would have been the seed, per se, of the church in Rome. Now, we also know later that Jews were kicked out of Rome. And some were able to come back. However, the writing here, they believe that the vast majority of the people in the church that Paul was writing to at this time were actually converts. See, this is even later when he's writing to the church there. Mostly Gentiles that had been converted. You're not saying that there's not a few Jews that were converted there as well, but the majority of the people were Gentiles. And if you want to refer to the first handout I gave you that has the outline on it, the numbered 6 points there, you can see a little breakdown of the book itself. Now, I mentioned just a second ago, there's multiple ways. Karen, if you wouldn't mind putting up that slide, please, ma'am. Thank you. There are multiple, the one previous, if you don't mind. Thank you. There are multiple ways, as you'll see, to break down the book of Romans. You can have two people read a book, and they can outline it and have different points. They're all valid points. This is just one of the breakdown. Of course, it starts out with Paul introducing himself, talking about why we need the gospel, and he says, this is why you need it, and this is why you need it. And in the third point there, the blessing is where you receive through the gospel. Then he talks about the gospel and the physical nation of Israel. And then he goes into practical implications and then a conclusion. That's a little bit higher level outline. And then the other handout I gave you, if you notice at the very top, there's only 3 points. They only put 3 points on there. It's the introductory statement, the propositions of aim of the apostle, and then practical and conclusion. But then if you notice below, they break it down even more. I wanted to just add this one to it in case you wanted to, and this one here is a great way to see where we're going to be and what's coming up, because he breaks it down into smaller pieces. He actually has some of the things broken down there into 2 verses, literally. But so there's some great layouts of the book of Romans itself. So realistically, chapters 1 and 8 1 through 8 deal with explaining the gospel message and why we need to embrace the gospel, and explaining the benefits of what you basically get for being a Christian. And then he goes on, again to talk about the nation of Israel. And then he goes on to talk of how the gospel should be involved in our lives on a daily basis. So why don't we jump in? I forgot my Bible back there, but I do have the physical text here, so we'll go ahead and start. In chapter 1, it starts out, I don't know why I keep putting these glasses on. It says, Paul, a servant of Jesus, and I'm going to read 1 through 17 here, and then we'll come down and start breaking it down. It says, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son, who, as to his earthly life, was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Through him we receive grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. As you also are among those Gentiles whom are called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 8 it says, First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. What a wonderful thing. Then in verse 9 it says, God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers all the time, and I pray that now, at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among other Gentiles. Verse 14 states, I'm obliged both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel, also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Okay, I'm going to start breaking down 1 through 7 a little bit. We'll look at each verse real quick and just kind of point out a couple things, and then I'm going to summarize that first little section there, that introduction. One of the things that, it starts out, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, an apostle called expressly as other servants world. Do you notice that Paul doesn't say I'm an apostle and I'm a servant? He says I'm a servant first and an apostle that was appointed by God. So he's saying, look, I'm a servant, I'm an apostle, separated by God, appointed by God to preach the good news. Verse 2 there, he said, by the way, the good news I'm preaching, he promised beforehand by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. And it said, by the way, in those Holy Scriptures that it should be preached to the Gentiles. We know if we look back at the Old Testament, you want to do something fascinating in the Old Testament, go to an electronic version of the Bible and search 2 words, the nations, which stands for everybody that's not Israelites, the physical nation of Israelite. You'll be amazed at how often it talks about the Jewish people taking the gospel to the nations. But they didn't. Very, very little did they. I should say that. But as a nation, they were not trying to get the Greeks or the Romans or the Philistines or the anybody's to proselyte at that point, which would be to convert to Judaism. And jumping back in, 3 is kind of saying there, he says, this is who I am, this is what has been foretold, this is what I'm preaching concerning the coming of his Son, God's Son, to save the world, who was foretold was born of a woman descended from David. We, of course, know that. The King of Israel, with respect to his flesh. He was declared, we move on to 4, and it says, he was declared the Son of God, speaking of Jesus, of course, with great power of evidence to his holy spiritual nature by his resurrection from the dead after he had been crucified by the Jewish rulers for calling himself the Son of God. He was still resurrected from the dead. And I'm just kind of paraphrasing these verses, adding a little bit of new English, if you will, to them. And in verse 5 it says, from whom, since he was resurrected from the dead, Paul, had received miraculous powers and apostleship in order that through his preaching of the Son of God, Jesus, the obedience of faith may be given to him among the Gentiles on account of his being the Son of God. 6 and 7, it says, among the number of which Gentiles are also you, the called disciples of Jesus Christ, saying you are part of this group. And Paul goes on to basically say, since I've been commissioned to do this, to preach to the Gentiles, I'm writing to you who are in Rome, and more especially to those who are faithful to God. He wasn't coming to Rome just to preach to them. We'll see later how he talks about how he's been fruitful in other areas, and he wants to be fruitful among them by raising them up, strengthening them, but he also wants to be fruitful in getting converts from outside of Christianity. Um, let's see here. It's just a question. You know, Paul was set apart here to go to the Gentiles. We're all familiar with Matthew 28:20, the Great Commission, and other places where it's spelled out. I'm curious, have we not been called apart to go to people as well? What I mean by that, you know, I've talked about this before, you know, one or two people can't do it alone. I know people that Datha doesn't know, and she knows people I don't know. Same, you know, David comes in contact with people that I don't know. He's friends with them, and we all have a much bigger area of impact than one person does. And, you know, we are called to go, I should say. We may not be called like Gary is to go to India, but we're called to go to the people around us, and we're all around different people. Moving on, let's pick up in verse 8. I'm going to read 8 through 13 here real quick, and it says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of His Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now, at last by God's will, the way will be made open for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that each... and I'm sorry, I looked up at the clock and lost my place. I'm going to pick back up in 12. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles." So, you know, that's pretty straightforward, but let's kind of just go right through it real quick. Verse 8, you know, he's saying, I'm thankful to God that y'all have embraced the gospel, and that your faith is such that it's spoken of through all. He's going, and I am so glad y'all are Christians. I can't tell you how much pleasing it is to me that people know about y'all. All over the world, you're not, you know that old song, "This Little Light of Mine," you know what I'm talking about. They're not hiding their light under a bushel. No, sorry. But, you know, I mean, they're not. They weren't. If they would have been, people wouldn't have known about them. And he says, you know, and hey, you know, I want y'all to know, I'm so thankful you in your conversion. I pray for you all the time. That's what he's saying there in 9. I pray for you all the time. And 10, he's just like, look, I pray now that hopefully it's God's will that I'm able, you know, the way will be open for me to come to you. Of course, we know he does go to Rome, and not necessarily how he had wanted to. And then it goes on in verse 11, and he says, you know, look, I really want to see y'all. I want to help y'all. I want to give you something, some spiritual gift that you may stand firm against the heathens or against the Roman government or against idolatry and the Jews, everything that's against you. I want to give you something to help you stay strong. And in some ways, he's not saying I'm proud of you, but almost some ways he is. If we think about it. And then he says, and to be honest with you, hopefully I can encourage you and you can encourage me there in 12 and 13. He goes on to say, you know, don't think I hadn't wanted to come and see and preach to you. Don't think that. I've just been hindered in doing so. I want people to know the truth and to become Christians. so just kind of wrap that little section up right there. He's saying, look, I'm thankful for y'all. Y'all are amazing. People know about you everywhere. I pray for you all the time. I remember you always in my prayer, and I want to see you, that we can be beneficial to one another. We can lift each other up in our Christian walk. And I want to impart some gift to you so y'all can stand firm. And I've tried to come to you, but I haven't made it yet. But hopefully God will open the door for me to come there. We go into 14 and 15. And it says, I am obliged both to Greek and non-Greek, both to the wise and the foolish. This is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. I kind of wish he would have flopped those words around a little bit there. The wise and the foolish. It's almost like I'm obliged to Greeks and non-Greeks, to the wise and the foolish. That's why. Almost like, but he's saying we need to be preaching to everybody, and that's what I want to do. That's why I'm coming to you who are in Rome. Then we go on to verse 16, and it's saying quite possibly one of the most quoted verses out of Romans. And he says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. And of course, we know from John 3:16 there, when he says, for everyone who believes, we know that who believes thing is a synecdoche. It's a shortening of known information. They knew, if they were a Christian, what they had to do to be saved by grace. Thus, that's what it is. There's people today that still teach all you have to do is believe, and they ignore everything else that's written in the Gospels. Even stuff written by Paul. So, with that in mind. 17, for in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Let's move on to 18. We'll cover 18 through 25 here. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles, idols. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with each other. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Boy, that's something that's done today too. You know, we got the Druids that worship trees. Pretty much you're worshiping anything other than God, you're worshiping something that He created. Just to kind of paraphrase that through, he says, remember, the gospel alone is the power of God for salvation. And people haven't been doing what they're supposed to have been doing. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. They know the truth and continue to do evil and suppress the truth. 19, he says, for this crime, all the statesmen, philosophers, all the important people, all the, what are the priestesses and priests and stuff and all this other stuff, they've been guilty because they know of God. And God is known among them, for God has shown it to them by His works of creation. He says, my apologies. He says, and they don't have an excuse. God's nature and eternal power can be seen by man in His creation. Even though they knew God, moving on to 21, kind of paraphrasing, he said, even though they knew God, they didn't glorify Him or even thank Him, and their hearts were darkened and their thoughts were foolish. So all these important people thought they were wise. They actually became fools in their own religion. 23 kind of, they're like, for they misrepresented the perfections of an incorruptible God by an image made in the likeness of corruptible men, birds, beasts, and reptiles. And because of that, they led people to believe that God was like the animals whose image they worshipped. 24 there. And so as punishment, God gave these pretended wise men up to every sorts of nastiness. They dishonored their own bodies between themselves, and the smart ones pretended to worship God, but instead worshiped idols, worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So just kind of summarize 18 to 25 there, that section that's broken off. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the sin of men who suppress the truth, basically. The Gentiles had the truth, for God had made it known to them, as we talked about through His creation. But when they knew God, they didn't glorify Him as God. By their reasoning, they became foolish and dull in the heart. They exchanged the honor due to God for the worship of idols. Because of that, God gave them up to their sexual passions, and as a result, they dishonored their bodies among themselves. You know what? We started a couple minutes late. Let's run through the end here, if y'all don't mind. Because of this, God gave them over, in 26, it says, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relationships for unnatural one. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with the lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They even invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they don't. Not only do they continue to do that, but they approve of those who practice them. So that last little bit there, if we just summarize that last bit there instead of going through each verse line by line, I wrote, being abandoned of God, their men and women degraded themselves. They received, and because of that, they received in their own bodies a due reward for their acts. They rejected God from their knowledge, and He rejected them. After this, they became filled with every vice and every crime. They not only practiced themselves, but even had delight in others practicing in them. All this they did, knowing the decree of God, both against their sins and against themselves. So therefore they sinned willfully and recklessly. Um, so just go through the whole chapter there very briefly. If you want to summarize it all up to a 10,000 point of view. We've got Paul here that was appointed an apostle by God to spread the word to everyone. And he's been wanting to go to Rome, and he's been wanting to preach there and to see them, but he's been delayed. He wants to encourage them and hopefully be encouraged by them, because it's important that he preach the gospel to them. The problem is sin is rampant, and people know better because they know better because of the nature of God around them. God has given them, sin was so bad, he gave them over to themselves. And basically they ran with it. Men with men, women with women, and everything and every way they can think of sinning, they are. Thank you all for spending about two to 3 minutes over on that. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back next week. Can you believe it? We made it through a whole chapter. We might do that again next week. Who knows? That's not a commonplace most of the time, to be honest with you. We love all of you, and we hope you have a wonderful evening. And if you're online only and would like the 2 outlines, just send us a message, and I'll be glad to send you those files electronically. We love you and hope you have a blessed evening.